1,000 Miles Up the Nile. Section 52. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 18. Discoveries at Abu Simbel, Part 1. We came back to find a fleet of dahabeahs ranged along the shore at Abu Simbel, and no less than 3 sketching tents in occupation of the ground. One of these, which happened to be pitched on the precise spot vacated by our painter, was courteously shifted to make way for the original tenant, and in the course of a couple of hours we were all as much at home as if we had not been away for half a day. Here, meanwhile, was our old acquaintance the Fawcett, with her party of gentlemen, yonder the Zenobia, all ladies, the little Alice with Sir J. C. and Mr. W. on board, the Serena flying the stars and stripes, the Mansoura bound presently for the Fayoum. To these were next day added the Ebers with a couple of German savants, and the Bagstones, welcome back from Wadi Halfa. What with arrivals and departures, exchange of visits, exhibitions of sketches, and sociabilities of various kinds, we now had quite a gay time. The Philae gave a dinner party in fantasia under the very noses of the Colossi, and every evening there was drumming and howling enough among the assembled crews to raise the ghosts of Rameses and all his queens. This was pleasant enough while it lasted, but when the strangers dropped off one by one, and at the end of 3 days we were once more alone, I think we were not sorry. The place, somehow, was too solemn for singing, laughing, ogling, and all that. It was by comparing our watches with those of the travellers whom we met at Abu Simbel that we now found out how hopelessly our timekeepers and theirs had gone astray. We had been altering ours continually ever since leaving Cairo, but the sun was as continually putting them wrong again, so that we had lost all count of the true time. The first words with which we now greeted a newcomer was, "Do you know what o'clock it is?" To which the stranger as invariably replied that it was the very question he himself was about to ask. The confusion became at last so great that, finding we had about 11 hours of day to 13 of night, we decided to establish an arbitrary canon, so we called it 7 when the sun rose, and 6 when it set, which answered every purpose. It was between 2 and 4 o'clock, according to this time of ours, that the Southern Cross was now visible every morning. It is undoubtedly best seen at Abu Simbel. The river here is very wide, and just where the constellation rises there is an opening in the mountains on the eastern bank, so that these 4 fine stars, though still low in the heavens, are seen in a free space of sky. If they make, even so, a less magnificent appearance than one has been led to expect, it is probably because we see them from too low a point of view. To say that a constellation is foreshortened sounds absurd, yet that is just what is the matter with the Southern Cross at Abu Simbel. Viewed at an angle of about 30 degrees, it necessarily looks distort and dim. If seen burning in the zenith, it would no doubt come up to the level of its reputation. It was now the 5th day of our return from Wadi Halfa when an event occurred that roused us to an unwonted pitch of excitement, and kept us at high pressure throughout the rest of our time. The day was Sunday, the date February 16, 1874, the time, according to Philae reckoning, about 11 a.m., when the painter, enjoying his 7th day's holiday after his own fashion, went strolling about among the rocks. He happened to turn his steps southwards, and passing the front of the great temple, climbed to the top of a little shapeless mound of fallen cliff, and sand, and crude brick wall, just against the corner where the mountain slopes down to the river. Immediately round this corner, looking almost due south, and approachable by only a narrow ledge of rock, are 2 votive tablets sculptured and painted, both of the 38th year of Rameses II. We had seen these from the river as we came back from Wadi Halfa, and had remarked how fine the view must be from that point. Beyond the fact that they are coloured, and that the colour upon them is still bright, there is nothing remarkable about these inscriptions. There are many such at Abu Simbel. Our painter did not, therefore, come here to examine the tablets. He was attracted solely by the view. Turning back presently, his attention was arrested by some much mutilated sculptures on the face of the rock, a few yards nearer the south buttress of the temple. He had seen these sculptures before, so indeed had I when wandering about that first day in search of a point of view, without especially remarking them. The relief was low, the execution slight, and the surface so broken away that only a few confused outlines remained. The thing that now caught the painter's eye, however, was a long crack running transversely down the face of the rock. It was such a crack as might have been caused, one would say, by blasting. He stooped, cleared the sand away a little with his hand, observed that the crack widened, poked in the point of his stick, and found that it penetrated to a depth of 2 or 3 feet. Even then it seemed to him to stop, not because it encountered any obstacle, but because the crack was not wide enough to admit the thick end of the stick. This surprised him. No mere fault in the natural rock, he thought, would go so deep. He scooped away a little more sand, and still the cleft widened. He introduced the stick a second time. It was a long palm stick like an alpenstock, and it measured about 5 feet in length. When he probed the cleft with it this second time, it went in freely up to where he held it in his hand. That is to say, to a depth of quite 4 feet. Convinced now that there was some hidden cavity in the rock, he carefully examined the surface. There were yet visible a few hieroglyphic characters and part of 2 cartouches, as well as some battered outlines of what had once been figures. The heads of these figures were gone, the face of the rock, with whatever may have been sculptured upon it, having come away bodily at this point, while from the waist downwards they were hidden under the sand. Only some hands and arms, in short, could be made out. They were the hands and arms apparently of 4 figures, 2 in the centre of the composition and 2 at the extremities. The 2 centre ones, which seemed to be back to back, probably represented gods, the outer ones worshippers. All at once it flashed upon the painter that he had seen this kind of group many a time before, and generally over a doorway. Feeling sure now that he was on the brink of a discovery, he came back, fetched away Salome and Mehemet Ali, and without saying a syllable to anyone, set to work with these 2 to scrape away the sand at the spot where the crack widened. Meanwhile, the luncheon bell having rung thrice, we concluded that the painter had rambled off somewhere into the desert, and so sat down without him. Towards the close of the meal, however, came a pencilled note, the contents of which ran as follows: "Pray come immediately. I have found the entrance to a tomb. Please send some sandwiches. A.M.C." To follow the messenger at once to the scene of action was the general impulse. In less than 10 minutes we were there, asking breathless questions, peeping in through the fast-widening aperture, and helping to clear away the sand. All that Sunday afternoon, heedless of possible sunstroke, unconscious of fatigue, we toiled upon our hands and knees, as for bare life, under the burning sun. We had the crew up, working like tigers. Every one helped, even the dragoman and the 2 maids. More than once, when we paused for a moment's breathing space, we said to each other, "If those at home could see us, what would they say?" And now, more than ever, we felt the need of implements. With a spade or 2 and a wheelbarrow we could have done wonders, but with only 1 small fire shovel, a birch broom, a couple of charcoal baskets, and about 20 pairs of hands, we were poor indeed. What was wanted in means, however, was made up in method. Some scraped away the sand, some gathered it into baskets, some carried the baskets to the edge of the cliff and emptied them into the river. The idle man distinguished himself by scooping out a channel where the slope was steepest, which greatly facilitated the work. Emptied down this chute and kept continually going, the sand poured off in a steady stream like water. Meanwhile the opening grew rapidly larger. When we first came up, that is, when the painter and the 2 sailors had been working on it for about an hour, we found a hole scarcely as large as one's hand, through which it was just possible to catch a dim glimpse of painted walls within. By sunset the top of the doorway was laid bare, and where the crack ended in a large triangular fracture, there was an aperture about 1.5 feet square, into which Mehemet Ali was the first to squeeze his way. We passed him in a candle and a box of matches, but he came out again directly, saying that it was a most beautiful berba, and quite light within. The writer wiggled in next. She found herself looking down from the top of a sand slope into a small square chamber. This sand drift, which here rose to within 1.5 feet of the top of the doorway, was heaped to the ceiling in the corner behind the door. There was light enough to see every detail distinctly, the painted frieze running round just under the ceiling, the bas-relief sculptures on the walls, gorgeous with unfaded colour, the smooth sand pitted near the top where Mehemet Ali had trodden, but undisturbed elsewhere by human foot; the great gap in the middle of the ceiling, where the rock had given way; the fallen fragments on the floor, now almost buried in sand. Satisfied that the place was absolutely fresh and untouched, the writer crawled out, and the others one by one crawled in. When each had seen it in turn, the opening was barricaded for the night, the sailors being forbidden to enter it, lest they should injure the decorations. That evening was held a solemn council, whereat it was decided that Ptolemy and Rais Hassan should go tomorrow to the nearest village, there to engage the services of 50 able-bodied natives. With such help we calculated that the place might easily be cleared in 2 days. If it was a tomb, we hoped to discover the entrance to the mummy pit below; if but a small chapel or speos like those at Ibram, we should at least have the satisfaction of seeing all that it contained in the way of sculptures and inscriptions. This was accordingly done, but we worked again next morning just the same till midday. Our native contingent, numbering about 40 men, then made their appearance in a rickety old boat, the bottom of which was half full of water. They had been told to bring implements, and they did bring such as they had: 2 broken oars to dig with, some baskets, and a number of little slips of planking which, being tied between 2 pieces of rope and drawn along the surface, acted as scrapers, and were useful as far as they went. Squatting in double file from the entrance of the speos to the edge of the cliff, and to the burden of a rude chant propelling these improvised scrapers, the men began by clearing a path to the doorway. This gave them work enough for the afternoon. At sunset, when they dispersed, the path was scooped out to a depth of 4 feet, like a miniature railway cutting between embankments of sand. Next morning came the Sheik in person, with his 2 sons and a following of 100 men. This was so many more than we had bargained for, that we at once foresaw a scheme to extort money. The Sheik, however, proved to be that same Rashwan ebn Hassan el-Kashif, by whom the happy couple had been so hospitably entertained about a fortnight before. We therefore received him with honour, invited him to luncheon, and hoping to get the work done, quickly set the men on in gangs under the superintendence of Rais Hassan and the head sailor. By noon the door was cleared down to the threshold, and the whole south and west walls were laid bare to the floor. We now found that the debris which blocked the north wall in the centre of the floor was not, as we had at first supposed, a pile of fallen fragments, but one solid boulder which had come down bodily from above. To remove this was impossible. We had no tools to cut or break it, and it was both wider and higher than the doorway. Even to clear away the sand which rose behind it to the ceiling would have taken a long time, and have caused the inevitable injury to the paintings around. Already the brilliancy of the colour was marred where the men had leaned their backs, all wet with perspiration, against the walls. Seeing, therefore, that 3/4 of the decorations were now uncovered, and that behind the fallen block there appeared to be no subject of great size and importance, we made up our minds to carry the work no further. Meanwhile we all had great fun at luncheon with our Nubian Sheik, a tall, well-featured man with much natural dignity of manner. He was well dressed, too, and wore a white turban most symmetrically folded, a white vest buttoned to the throat, a long loose robe of black serge, an outer robe of fine black cloth with hanging sleeves and a hood, and on his feet white stockings and scarlet morocco shoes. When brought face to face with a knife and fork, his embarrassment was great. He was, it seemed, too grand a personage to feed himself. He must have a feeder, as the great man of the Middle Ages had a taster. Ptolemy, accordingly, being promoted to this office, picked out choice bits of mutton and chicken with his fingers, dropped pieces of bread and gravy, and put every morsel into our guest's august mouth, as if the said guest were a baby. The sweets being served, the little lady, Elle, and the writer took him in hand, and fed him with all kinds of jams and preserved fruits. Enchanted with these attentions, the poor man ate till he could eat no longer, then laid his hand pathetically over the region next to his heart, and cried for mercy. After luncheon he smoked his chibouk, and coffee was served. Our coffee did not please him. He tasted it, but immediately returned the cup, telling the waiter with a grimace that the berries were burned and the coffee weak. When, however, we apologized for it, he protested with oriental insincerity that it was excellent. To amuse him was easy, for he was interested in everything: in Elle's field glass, in the painter's accordion, in the piano and the lever corkscrew. With some eau de cologne he was also greatly charmed, rubbing it on his beard and inhaling it with closed eyes, in a kind of rapture. To make talk was as usual the great difficulty. When he had told us that his eldest son was governor of Dair, that his youngest was 5 years of age, that the dates of Dair were better than the dates of Wadi Halfa, and that the Nubian people were very poor, he was at the end of his topics. Finally he requested us to convey a letter from him to Lord D., who had entertained him on board his dahabeah the year before. Being asked if he had brought his letter with him, he shook his head, saying, "Your dragoman shall write it." So paper and a reed pen were produced, and Ptolemy wrote to dictation as follows: "God have care of you. I hope you are well. I am sorry not to have had a letter from you since you were here. Your brother and friend, Rushwan Ebn Hassan el-Kashif." A model letter this, brief and to the point. End of section 52.